For years, the Deerfield Medical Center had been known for its compassionate care, with a staff that dedicated themselves to the well-being of their patients. But there was one doctor whose presence in the building seemed to elevate it beyond the ordinary. Dr. John Whitmore. A tall, unassuming man with a calm, reassuring voice, he had become the cornerstone of the hospital's gynecology department. He was, in every sense, a respected and well-liked figure in the community, a doctor who had built a reputation for providing exceptional care to the women of Deerfield. Dr. Whitmore's patients trusted him implicitly, and many of them considered him more than just their doctor. He was a confidant, a guide, and a friend. His gentle demeanor and compassionate nature made even the most difficult of medical exams feel routine. The women who came through his doors left with more than just a prescription or treatment plan. They left feeling understood, safe, and valued. Dr. Whitmore was everything a doctor should be: kind, competent, and trustworthy. But beneath the surface of his outward charm, something far more sinister was at play. No one could have suspected that the man who had earned the admiration of the entire town was hiding a dark secret. A secret so twisted, so horrific, that it would ultimately shatter the lives of the very people who trusted him most. As the years passed, a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern began to emerge. Women who had visited Dr. Whitmore for routine gynecological exams started to go missing. At first, it was easy to dismiss as nothing more than coincidence. After all, small towns like Deerfield rarely experienced the kind of tragedy that made headlines. But as time went on, the disappearances became harder to ignore. The families of the missing women were left to grapple with the void left by their loved ones, all while law enforcement struggled to find answers. The first signs of something amiss came when a local woman was Emily Harper, a 32-year-old woman whose warmth and kindness left an indelible mark on those who knew her. A loving wife to her husband, Michael, and a devoted mother to 2 young children, Emily was the epitome of a small-town success story. She was known for her involvement in local charities, her infectious laughter, and her unwavering optimism. It was a crisp autumn morning when Emily stepped into Dr. John Whitmore's office for what she believed to be a routine checkup. She had recently given birth to her second child and wanted to ensure everything was in order. Dr. Whitmore had been her gynecologist for years, and she trusted him implicitly. After all, he had been there through her pregnancies, offering guidance, care, and reassurance. He was the doctor everyone in Deerfield recommended, a pillar of the community whose name was synonymous with compassion and professionalism. Emily's appointment began like any other. Dr. Whitmore greeted her with his signature warm smile and a calming demeanor that immediately put her at ease. They chatted briefly about her family, her work, and how she was adjusting to life with a newborn. It was a conversation designed to make her feel comfortable, to lower her guard. As the appointment progressed, Dr. Whitmore's questions took a more personal turn. He asked about her emotional state, her relationship with her husband, and whether she felt supported at home. While the questions seemed caring on the surface, they were laced with an undertone of prying. Emily, ever trusting, answered candidly, unaware of the doctor's hidden motives. During the exam, Dr. Whitmore mentioned a minor irregularity that he wanted to monitor closely. He assured Emily it was likely nothing to worry about but recommended additional tests, just to be safe. His tone was one of concern, his gaze unwavering, as if he truly had her best interests at heart. Emily agreed without hesitation, grateful for his diligence. What Emily didn't know was that this irregularity was entirely fabricated. Dr. Whitmore had no intention of conducting legitimate tests. Instead, he used the pretense of medical necessity to orchestrate a series of follow-up visits, each one bringing her deeper into his web of manipulation. Over the next few weeks, Emily returned to Dr. Whitmore's office for further examinations. Each time, he employed the same charm and reassurance that had earned him the trust of countless patients. He went out of his way to make her feel special, offering extra time during appointments and calling to check on her well-being. To Emily, it seemed like extraordinary care. To Dr. Whitmore, it was a calculated move to deepen her trust and dependency. His manipulation extended beyond the exam room. He began offering unsolicited advice on her personal life, positioning himself as a confidant rather than just her doctor. He subtly planted seeds of doubt about her health, creating a sense of unease that only he could alleviate. Emily, overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood and trusting in his authority, relied on his guidance without question. On the morning of October 17th, Emily told her husband she was heading to another appointment with Dr. Whitmore. She kissed her children goodbye and promised to be back by lunchtime. But Emily never returned. When Michael realized his wife hadn't come home, he began calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Hours turned into a sleepless night, and by the next morning, Michael reported her missing to the Deerfield Police Department. The initial investigation yielded little. Emily's car was found parked outside Dr. Whitmore's office, but there were no signs of struggle or foul play. Dr. Whitmore himself was cooperative when questioned, expressing shock and concern over her disappearance. He mentioned that she had left his office in good spirits and speculated that she might have been overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood. His words, spoken with apparent sincerity, temporarily diverted suspicion away from him. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that Emily's body was discovered by hikers in a dense forest just outside town. She was found partially buried, her body showing signs of trauma. The news devastated the community. Emily Harper, the woman who had embodied the spirit of Deerfield, was gone. Her family was plunged into unimaginable grief, while the town struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could happen in their peaceful corner of the world. The autopsy revealed that Emily had been strangled, and there were signs of chemical sedation in her system. Investigators were puzzled by the lack of evidence connecting anyone to the crime. There were no witnesses, no security footage, and no clear motive. Emily's death seemed like an isolated, inexplicable act of violence. Deerfield was a town in mourning. Vigils were held in Emily's honor, with hundreds of residents gathering to pay their respects. Her funeral was a somber affair, with tearful eulogies recounting her kindness and generosity. The local church set up a fund to support her children, and the police vowed to bring her killer to justice. Amid the grief, there was confusion. Who could have done this and why? The town had no answers, and the lack of progress in the investigation left residents feeling both vulnerable and desperate for closure. Rumors began to circulate, but Dr. Whitmore's name was never among them. To the community, he was the same compassionate doctor they had always known, a man who had been as heartbroken as anyone else by Emily's death. What no one realized was that Dr. Whitmore had carefully orchestrated every detail of Emily's disappearance and murder. He had exploited her trust, manipulated her vulnerability, and eliminated her when she threatened to expose his dark obsession. Her death was not a crime of passion or impulse. It was the calculated act of a man determined to keep his secrets hidden at all costs. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation into Emily's murder stalled, and life in Deerfield slowly returned to normal. Dr. Whitmore continued to practice medicine, his reputation untarnished. But Emily's death was only the beginning. For Dr. Whitmore, the first victim was a test, a twisted experiment in control and concealment. And with his success came the confidence to strike again. Laura Evans was a 20-year-old college student home for the holidays. Vibrant and ambitious, she was studying biology at a nearby university with dreams of becoming a veterinarian. On a chilly December morning, Laura visited Dr. Whitmore for a routine checkup before returning to campus. She had no reason to suspect that this visit would seal her fate. Dr. Whitmore immediately took a keen interest in Laura. Her cheerful demeanor and academic aspirations seemed to intrigue him, though he masked his fixation behind a professional exterior. During the exam, he mentioned noticing irregularities similar to those he had fabricated in Emily Harper's case. He suggested follow-up tests and reassured Laura that it was likely nothing serious, but that he wanted to be thorough. Over the course of several appointments, Dr. Whitmore used the same manipulative tactics that had ensnared Emily. He positioned himself as a mentor, offering advice about Laura's studies and career while subtly sowing seeds of fear about her health. By the time she realized something was amiss, it was too late. Laura disappeared just after the new year. Her car was found parked near a hiking trail, leading investigators to believe she had gone for a walk and possibly gotten lost. However, her friends and family were adamant that Laura, an experienced hiker, would never have ventured out without telling someone. Weeks later, her body was discovered in a shallow grave in a remote area, her fate eerily mirroring Emily's. As the town mourned Laura's death, the parallels between her case and Emily's became harder to ignore. Both women had visited Dr. Whitmore shortly before their disappearances, and both had been found in similar circumstances. Yet, the idea that their trusted doctor could be involved in such heinous acts was inconceivable to most. Dr. Whitmore's patients spanned a wide demographic, but his victims shared specific traits that made them targets of his obsession. They were young, vibrant women whose trust he could exploit and whose lives he felt he could manipulate. Each was at a vulnerable crossroads, Emily as a new mother, Laura as a student far from home. These commonalities allowed him to weave his sinister web with chilling precision. Dr. Whitmore's success in evading suspicion stemmed from his ability to exploit the trust inherent in his role as a physician. As a gynecologist, he had access to his victims' most personal information, from medical histories to their emotional states. He used this knowledge not only to manipulate their trust but also to ensure their silence. In the office, he was meticulous, taking extensive notes that disguised his predatory intentions as thorough professionalism. He fabricated medical concerns to necessitate follow-up visits, creating opportunities to deepen his control over his victims. Outside the office, he maintained a facade of concern, calling to check on their well-being or offering unsolicited advice, all while plotting their ultimate demise. Dr. Whitmore's medical expertise also played a critical role in his ability to cover his tracks. He used sedatives to subdue his victims, ensuring they were defenseless when he carried out his crimes. The drugs he chose were difficult to detect in post-mortem examinations, further complicating investigators' efforts to piece together the truth. His knowledge of anatomy and forensic science allowed him to leave behind minimal physical evidence, making it nearly impossible to link him directly to the murders. The pattern became undeniable with the disappearance of Sarah Milligan, a 27-year-old teacher who had recently moved to Deerfield. Sarah had scheduled an appointment with Dr. Whitmore for a routine exam, trusting the recommendations of her new neighbors who spoke highly of him. Sarah's disappearance followed the same script as Emily's and Laura's. She visited Dr. Whitmore's office, attended a few follow-up appointments, and then vanished without a trace. Her body was discovered a month later, buried in a secluded area with signs of strangulation and sedation. By this point, whispers of a serial killer began to circulate, though the town still refused to believe that someone as revered as Dr. Whitmore could be responsible. For the families of the victims, the pain was unbearable. Each woman had been the center of her family's world, and their sudden, violent deaths left an unfillable void. Their grief was compounded by the lack of answers, as the investigation into their murders seemed to yield no concrete leads. Emily Harper's husband, Michael, she was the love of my life. We had our whole future planned out, and now I'm raising our children without her. I can't sleep at night wondering what she went through in her final moments. Laura Evans' mother, Diane, she had so much life ahead of her. She was going to change the world. And now she's gone, and I don't know why. All I want is justice for my daughter. Sarah Milligan's sister, Claire. Sarah was my best friend. We talked every day. Now there's just silence. Whoever did this didn't just take her life. They destroyed everyone who loved her. The community rallied around these grieving families, offering support and solidarity. But beneath the surface, fear and suspicion began to take hold. Women questioned their safety, and whispers about the similarities between the cases grew louder. Through it all, Dr. Whitmore continued his practice, his mask of compassion and professionalism firmly in place. He attended vigils for the victims, offering condolences to their families and participating in fundraisers to support their causes. To the outside world, he was a man grieving alongside his community. Yet, behind closed doors, Dr. Whitmore meticulously planned his next moves. Each murder emboldened him, reinforcing his belief that he could outsmart law enforcement and continue his twisted pursuit without consequence. His position of power and the trust he commanded allowed him to remain hidden in plain sight, even as the evidence began to point toward him. While Dr. Whitmore's crimes remained hidden for the time being, his confidence began to waver as law enforcement increased their scrutiny. Investigators started to notice the pattern connecting the victims to his practice, though they lacked the evidence to act. The families, desperate for answers, pushed for justice, their voices growing louder with each passing day. The stage was set for the investigation that would eventually expose Dr. Whitmore's dark secrets. But for now, he remained untouchable. His crimes a testament to the danger of misplaced trust and the lengths to which one man would go to satisfy his obsession. From the outside, Dr. John Whitmore's life appeared picture-perfect. He was a respected physician, a devoted husband, and a doting father. His pristine house on Elmwood Lane was a symbol of his success, complete with a white picket fence, a manicured lawn, and family portraits on the walls. He attended church every Sunday with his wife, Claire, and their 2 teenage children, exuding the aura of a man deeply rooted in his community. Yet, behind closed doors, the reality of Dr. Whitmore's life was far more sinister. Dr. Whitmore's professional image was carefully curated to maintain the trust and admiration of his patients and peers. He spent long hours at the hospital, earning a reputation as a tireless worker who went above and beyond for his patients. He volunteered at health fairs, mentored medical students, and even organized charity events to support women's health initiatives. At home, he played the role of the ideal family man. He attended his children's school events, coached his son's soccer team, and celebrated every family milestone with enthusiasm. Claire often boasted to friends about her husband's dedication, marveling at how he balanced his demanding career with his responsibilities as a father and husband. But the cracks in this facade were subtle yet present. He was frequently on call, spending nights at the hospital or retreating to his home office for hours at a time. Claire attributed his absences to the pressures of his job, never suspecting that his late-night hours were devoted to something far darker. In the basement of the Whitmore home was a locked door that no one but John was allowed to enter. To his family, it was simply his private workspace, a sanctuary where he could review patient files and prepare for surgeries. In reality, it was a chamber of horrors, the physical manifestation of his obsessive, predatory nature. Inside the room, neatly arranged on shelves and in drawers, was a chilling collection of mementos from his victims. Each item was carefully cataloged, labeled with dates and names, and accompanied by detailed entries in his journals. Emily Harper's scarf, Laura Evans' bracelet, Sarah Milligan's hair tie, each object held profound meaning for Dr. Whitmore, serving as tangible reminders of his control and dominance over their lives. The walls were lined with medical textbooks and anatomical charts, interspersed with photographs he had secretly taken of his victims during their appointments. He had even kept copies of their medical records, meticulously annotated with notes that revealed his twisted thoughts and plans. To him, this room was a shrine to his brilliance, a testament to his ability to manipulate and dominate. Dr. Whitmore's journals were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his hidden world. Written in a mix of clinical precision and emotional fervor, they documented his crimes in excruciating detail. He described the fear in his victims' eyes, the sense of power he felt as he silenced them, and the meticulous steps he took to ensure he left no evidence behind. The journals also revealed the depth of his obsession. He didn't view his victims as individuals but as objects of fascination, their lives reduced to mere components of his perverse fantasies. He wrote about their physical attributes, their personalities, and their vulnerabilities, often focusing on how he exploited their trust to achieve his goals. While Dr. Whitmore's journals provided a glimpse into his psyche, they also hinted at the origins of his obsession. He frequently referenced his childhood, describing a strict and emotionally distant father who demanded perfection and a mother who oscillated between overbearing affection and cold detachment. This unstable environment, coupled with early experiences of rejection and humiliation, seemed to have shaped his view of women as both objects of desire and sources of control. He recounted incidents from his youth where he had manipulated classmates and neighbors, testing the boundaries of their trust. These early experiments in dominance laid the foundation for the predator he would later become. Medicine, with its inherent power dynamics, offered him the perfect avenue to continue these behaviors under the guise of professionalism. In the warped logic of Dr. Whitmore's mind, his actions were not crimes but acts of brilliance. He saw himself as a master of manipulation, a man capable of bending others to his will. His journals often reflected his belief that his victims belonged to him, that their lives were meant to serve his needs and desires. He rationalized his murders as necessary to maintain his secret. In his view, the risk of exposure outweighed the value of their lives. He wrote about the cost of greatness, framing his actions as sacrifices required to preserve his carefully constructed world. In one particularly chilling entry, he wrote, "They trust me. They confide in me. I am their protector, their savior. They give me their fears, their vulnerabilities, and in return, I take what is mine. It is not cruelty. It is order. It is my right." Dr. Whitmore also believed he was untouchable. His meticulous planning, combined with his esteemed position in the community, gave him a sense of invincibility. He saw the investigations into the murders as validation of his brilliance, taking pride in the fact that law enforcement had no idea they were pursuing a man they admired and trusted. Despite his confidence, maintaining his double life took its toll. Dr. Whitmore's need for control extended to every aspect of his existence, leaving him constantly on edge. He became irritable with his family, snapping at Claire and his children for minor infractions. His meticulous nature turned into paranoia, with obsessive cleaning rituals and constant checks of his alibis. Claire began to notice changes in her husband. He seemed more distant, more secretive. While she attributed his behavior to stress, small details began to unsettle her. The locked door in the basement, the way he avoided eye contact during difficult conversations, the occasional uncharacteristic coldness in his tone. But she pushed these thoughts aside, unwilling to confront the possibility that the man she loved might be hiding something sinister. As the investigation into the murders intensified, so did Dr. Whitmore's need to maintain control. He became even more cautious, limiting his interactions with patients and avoiding any behavior that might draw attention. Yet, the pressure began to crack his carefully constructed facade. The thrill he derived from his crimes was no longer enough to quell the fear of discovery. He found himself obsessing over the smallest details, replaying the events in his mind to ensure he hadn't made a mistake. His once unshakable confidence wavered, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Dr. Whitmore's double life was a precarious balance, and with each passing day, the weight of his secrets threatened to bring it all crashing down. Unbeknownst to him, the walls were closing in, and the mask he had worn so flawlessly was beginning to slip. The investigation into the disappearances began in earnest after the discovery of Emily Harper's body. Detective Rachel Morgan, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving cold cases, was assigned to lead the effort. Her approach was meticulous. She believed that the smallest detail could unravel even the most complex mystery. As additional victims were discovered, Morgan and her team began to piece together the chilling similarities. Each victim was a young woman who had no apparent enemies, and their bodies were found in remote locations, suggesting the killer had knowledge of the area. The team hypothesized that the perpetrator was someone who lived locally and had access to detailed information about the victims' lives. Despite these insights, there was little physical evidence to go on. The killer had been meticulous, leaving no fingerprints or DNA at the crime scenes. Frustrated but undeterred, Morgan turned her attention to the victims' lives, searching for any commonalities that could provide a lead. A pivotal moment came when Laura Evans' college roommate, Megan, recalled a conversation she had overheard between Laura and her mother. Laura had mentioned feeling uneasy after one of her appointments with Dr. Whitmore, describing his behavior as too personal. Megan hadn't thought much of it at the time, but in hindsight, it seemed significant. Detective Morgan requested access to Dr. Whitmore's patient records, suspecting that he might be connected to the victims. However, without concrete evidence, obtaining a warrant was a challenge. It wasn't until another patient, Samantha Reed, came forward with her own unsettling experience that the tide began to turn. Samantha reported that Dr. Whitmore had insisted on multiple follow-up appointments for a minor issue. during which he had asked invasive personal questions unrelated to her medical care. With 2 testimonies linking Dr. Whitmore to suspicious behavior, the police finally secured a warrant to search his office and patient records. What they found was enough to send chills down the spines of even the most seasoned investigators. The search of Dr. Whitmore's office revealed a hidden file drawer containing unauthorized copies of medical records, many of which belonged to the victims. While this was not direct evidence of his involvement in their murders, it raised serious ethical and legal concerns. Investigators also found a series of coded notes that appeared to detail his interactions with specific patients, including Emily, Laura, and Sarah. The true breakthrough came during the search of Dr. Whitmore's home. In the locked basement room, investigators discovered his collection of mementos from the victims, along with his journals. The journals were damning, containing detailed accounts of each murder, from his initial interactions with the victims to the steps he took to cover his tracks. Forensic experts confirmed that several items in the room, including fibers and hair samples, matched evidence found at the crime scenes. The meticulous nature of Dr. Whitmore's documentation left no doubt about his guilt. Detective Morgan described the discovery as the horrifying glimpse into the mind of a calculated and deeply disturbed individual. Armed with overwhelming evidence, the police moved quickly to arrest Dr. Whitmore. The operation was carefully planned to avoid tipping him off, as investigators feared he might flee or harm himself if he suspected he was under suspicion. On a crisp autumn morning, as Dr. Whitmore was leaving his house for work, law enforcement officers surrounded him. Detective Morgan herself delivered the arrest warrant, reading the charges aloud as the once revered doctor stood in stunned silence. For the first time, his mask of composure slipped, and those present saw a glimpse of the fear and panic beneath his carefully curated exterior. The arrest sent shockwaves through Deerfield. News of Dr. Whitmore's double life spread rapidly, leaving residents reeling. Patients who had trusted him with their health and well-being were devastated, struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the monster he had been revealed to be. Claire Whitmore, his wife, was equally blindsided. She tearfully denied any knowledge of her husband's crimes, insisting that she had always believed him to be a kind and loving man. Her world, like the rest of the community's, had been shattered in an instant. The arrest of Dr. Whitmore became a national story, with media outlets descending on Deerfield to cover the shocking revelation. Headlines referred to him as the Deerfield Doctor of Death, and his face became synonymous with betrayal and horror. For the families of the victims, the news provided a bittersweet sense of relief. While they were grateful that their loved one's killer had been caught, the pain of their loss was as raw as ever. Many of them attended the press conference where Detective Morgan announced the arrest, holding photographs of their daughters and sisters as a stark reminder of the human cost of Dr. Whitmore's actions. Detective Morgan's statement to the press captured the gravity of the situation. Dr. John Whitmore used his position of trust and authority to commit unspeakable crimes against the very people who depended on him for care. Today, we take the first step toward justice for Emily Harper, Laura Evans, Sarah Milligan, and all the other lives he destroyed. This case is a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, and it is our duty to shine a light on it, no matter how well it is concealed. In the weeks following Dr. Whitmore's arrest, the town of Deerfield grappled with the fallout. Patients flooded the hospital with requests to have their records reviewed, terrified that they, too, might have been targets. The hospital administration issued public apologies and promised sweeping reforms to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. Community leaders organized vigils and memorials for the victims, transforming their grief into a collective resolve to honor their memories. The victims' families formed a support network, united by their shared loss and their determination to ensure that Dr. Whitmore was held accountable for his actions. The trial of Dr. John Whitmore was a spectacle that captivated the nation. Reporters and spectators packed the courthouse, eager to witness the unraveling of a man who had been both a savior and a predator. The courtroom itself became a battleground, with the prosecution determined to secure justice for the victims and the defense scrambling to cast doubt on the overwhelming evidence. What followed was a gripping drama that revealed not only the extent of Dr. Whitmore's crimes, but also the resilience of those who had been forever changed by his actions. The trial began on a somber note, with the families of the victims filling the gallery. Many clutched photographs of their loved ones, silent symbols of the lives that had been lost. Assistant District Attorney Melissa Grant opened with a powerful statement. Dr. John Whitmore used his position of trust to exploit, manipulate, and ultimately destroy the lives of those who depended on him. This trial is about holding him accountable for the immeasurable pain he has caused and ensuring he can never harm another person again. The prosecution's first witnesses were the families of the victims. Emily Harper's mother, Linda, recounted the last conversation she had with her daughter, her voice breaking as she described the hopes and dreams Emily had shared. Laura Evans' brother, Michael, spoke about the toll her death had taken on their family, while Sarah Milligan's fiancé described the haunting emptiness of a future stolen from them. Each testimony was a poignant reminder of the human cost of Dr. Whitmore's actions. The prosecution also called former colleagues to the stand. Many of them described Dr. Whitmore as meticulous and professional, but a few admitted to noticing odd behaviors. One nurse, Julia Carter, recounted an incident where Dr. Whitmore had taken an unusual interest in a patient's personal life, asking questions that seemed unrelated to her medical care. At the time, Julia had dismissed it as harmless, a decision she now regretted deeply. ADA Grant's strategy focused on the undeniable connections between Dr. Whitmore and the victims. She presented the journals found in his basement as the centerpiece of her case, emphasizing their detailed descriptions of his crimes. Each entry was displayed on a screen for the jury, accompanied by expert testimony from forensic psychologists who explained the significance of the obsessive and predatory language. The prosecution also relied heavily on forensic evidence. Fibers and hair samples found in Dr. Whitmore's home matched those collected from the crime scenes, and GPS data from his car placed him near the locations where the bodies were discovered. Grant methodically laid out each piece of evidence, building an airtight case that left little room for doubt. Dr. Whitmore's defense team faced an uphill battle. Their primary argument was that the evidence had been obtained illegally, a claim the judge ultimately dismissed. With no other viable options, they turned to character witnesses and attempts to discredit the prosecution's narrative. The defense portrayed Dr. Whitmore as a dedicated physician who had been falsely accused due to a series of unfortunate coincidences. They called several of his former patients to testify, many of whom described him as compassionate and attentive. One elderly woman tearfully recounted how Dr. Whitmore had saved her life during a difficult pregnancy, a moment that seemed to sow doubt among a few jurors. In a bold move, the defense also attempted to argue that the journals were fictional, a product of Dr. Whitmore's interest in true crime rather than a record of actual events. They claimed that the prosecution had failed to provide direct evidence linking the journals to the murders, a point that the defense hammered home repeatedly. Perhaps the most impactful moments of the trial came from former patients who bravely took the stand to share their unsettling experiences with Dr. Whitmore. Samantha Reed recounted how he had insisted on unnecessary follow-up appointments, during which his questions became increasingly invasive. Another patient, Jessica Moore, described an appointment where she felt so uncomfortable that she never returned, a decision that may have saved her life. These testimonies painted a chilling picture of a man who had carefully cultivated his image while using his position to prey on the vulnerable. They also provided crucial corroboration of the patterns detailed in Dr. Whitmore's journals, further dismantling the defense's argument. The turning point of the trial came when Detective Rachel Morgan took the stand. Her testimony was a masterclass in precision and professionalism, detailing the painstaking investigation that had led to Dr. Whitmore's arrest. She described the moment she discovered the basement room, the journals, and the mementos, emphasizing the meticulous nature of his crimes. Morgan's testimony was bolstered by forensic expert Dr. Allison Green, who explained how the evidence found in Dr. Whitmore's home and car conclusively linked him to the victims. Dr. Green's calm, authoritative demeanor made it difficult for the defense to challenge her findings. In a move that shocked many, Dr. Whitmore chose to testify in his own defense. He appeared calm and composed, addressing the jury directly as he denied any involvement in the murders. He claimed that the journals were merely a creative outlet, insisting that the prosecution had misinterpreted their contents. However, under cross-examination by ADA Grant, Dr. Whitmore's composure began to crack. When pressed about specific entries in the journals, he stumbled over his explanations, contradicting himself on several occasions. Grant's relentless questioning revealed the inconsistencies in his story, leaving the jury with little doubt about his guilt. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson read the decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. John Whitmore, guilty on all counts, and sentenced life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gallery erupted in a mix of relief and emotion. Families of the victims hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces as they finally saw justice served. Dr. Whitmore sat motionless, his once confident demeanor replaced by a vacant stare. The verdict sent a ripple through the community of Deerfield and beyond. While many were relieved that justice had been served, the betrayal of trust left deep scars. The hospital issued a public apology and pledged to implement stricter protocols to prevent similar abuses in the future. Vigils were held in memory of the victims, with the community coming together to honor their lives. The families expressed gratitude for the support they had received, vowing to channel their pain into advocacy for greater protections for patients.